And thanks everyone who've joined, and we're anticipating that we would have a few more people, but let them keep coming in as they join. Thanks for coming in. This is our first of our webinar series, and we decided to talk about what is on everybody's mind. See if the California AG is likely to delay the enforcement date for CCPA from July 1st, 2020 to potentially January 2nd or 1st, 2021. So that's the topic of our conversation today. Now we have on the panel, we have Brad Hammer. He's the founder and attorney at Vocaris Group. My name is DV, and I'm the founder of InfoSec Enforcer. Brad, a brief about yourself.
Sure. So yeah, I started my career in big law at a large firm, and then a little over 4 years ago, started my own solo practice focusing exclusively on privacy and cybersecurity compliance advising. So I advise clients that are large multinationals. I've advised startups, really just trying to do it in a more effective and efficient way as a solo practitioner, as opposed to sort of as part of big law, really honing in on sort of client business needs as opposed to sort of a cookie cutter compliance approach. So.
Thank you, Brad. So my name is DV, and I wrote a book on the CCPA compliance. So go to Amazon. We're going to have a free Kindle book available in a couple of days, and I will share that free version of Kindle with all of you. And just to set stage, the CCPA AB 375 was signed into law in May 2018, just before the ballot measure was going to go on the ballot in California. And the regulations related to that, the initial draft regulations came out in October 2019, and the California AG went through a process with respect to comments and feedback, and the law went into effect on Jan 1st, 2020 already. From my understanding and my reading, Brad, you could weigh in on this, less than probably 5, maybe 10% of companies have anything on their websites or otherwise in compliance with the law so far. Right?
Yeah, I mean, there's still a steady stream of my own clients coming to me asking about CCPA compliance. One, whether or not it applies, and the degree to which it applies, what they need to be doing from both a website perspective and general compliance. And part of that is due, in part to the fact that some of the regs coming out of the AG are still a bit in flux in terms of what that's actually going to need to look like from a privacy policy that's appearing on a website and that. And some companies have run with the information that they have available, and some have taken a wait and see approach. It is variable at this point, though.
Right. So the main topic of our discussion today is to see if the enforcement is likely to begin on the 1st of July or not. So let's just get into that, right? So there are two risks that I see, Brad. One is the enforcement risk. It could be anywhere between $2,500 to about $7,500 per violation. Could you, Brad, give us an example of what could one of those violations be?
Yeah, I mean, it could be, a failure to respond to a request, whether that be to deletion or access or something like that. It could be whether on the low end of that fine, it would be an honest mistake by a company in terms of they lost the request, or more egregious, being that they're deliberately ignoring it or deliberately chose to not try to be in compliance with it. Everything from sort of those baseline consumer requests up to significant breaches that actually demonstrate a failure of that company to properly protect the data. So
nice, interesting. And the second risk that we see is the class action risk, which is more to do with the private action that is awarded in thing. And I've seen an initial lawsuit filed on February 3rd. I think it was updated also in the first or second week of March, from what I understand. And this where the defendants are Salesforce and HANA. HANA is a clothing company, right? So do you see, I have seen, I believe, about 7 or 8 similar lawsuits already. What have you seen?
Yeah, these are all in the breach context because that's where the private right of action under CCPA comes up, and it's interesting because a lot of these are lawsuits that maybe would have already happened to some degree, but the CCPA is giving them a cause of action that's, I think, more easier to recover under, right? It's a set number. If you can make your case under the statute, it's not as if a jury has to decide what the damages are. The statute's providing you what that number might be for at least a range of what that number could be, even under a private right of action. And so it's coming as a part of other lawsuits, and that may otherwise already have been taking place, and then rapidly moving to a place where, as these events are happening this year, into where that will likely probably be the primary cause of action. With any lawsuit, they'll throw the kitchen sink in, but the CCPA is an easy one for private right of action. So.
Right. So which one do you think is more riskier and financially draining for any company? The enforcement risk or the private class action?
I mean, at this point, the private class action is probably going to be the bigger number, at least in the current, at least in the near term, because of the amounts that those folks filing lawsuits might put on that. Because as the Attorney General is still sort of ramping up, right? But as the Attorney General looks to take action in a similar fashion to the way they did in Europe with those privacy regulators, where the regulators are understaffed and cash strapped, and one of the ways they can help sort of boost their own enforcement is by sort of initiating a number of fines, and they'll target some of the big entities initially. But I think, in the near term, in the next few months, it's going to be these lawsuits, in part because there's also an initial high cost associated with defending yourself from those, because you have to immediately hire your own lawyers to, litigation lawyers, and that might be a team of people as opposed to a couple compliance folks. So.
Okay. So now, when it comes to the pandemic, it obviously impacted a lot of projects in a number of companies. Almost every company it has impacted. It has an impact on projects. I am specifically noticing that the focus is indeed on some essential projects. And what are you seeing with respect to any CCPA projects moving forward? What was your reaction from your customers?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, to the second point here, compliance is not revenue generating or essential. I would certainly argue that point with you, DB, but the point is not what I think is revenue generating or essential. It's what the C-suite or what the management or what those that are managing the budgets and looking at the reality of what this COVID-19 is doing to budgets around the world. I mean, I've had any number of clients that have ceased or certainly slowed down their CCPA efforts, many times due to budget cuts, as we say here, and their personnel not being available to them. Where legal and compliance departments are certainly being reduced, so they're trying to figure out how to do this in a more cost-effective way, or they're just tabling it for now, which could create some interesting, it'll be interesting to see when July hits how that actually plays out for some of for some clients and businesses that are tabling these projects. So.
Right. Interestingly, what I have noticed is the mid-sized companies like almost standstill, nothing moving at all. And we have seen a few very large companies come in and ask more questions about evaluation, how about this, how about that, that kind of stuff. So it's a slow burn, but the evaluations are going on. And then, interestingly, we've seen some agencies, so to say, have come up and said, while they don't need to be compliant with CCPA, they want to be compliant with CCPA. So that was a very interesting thing for us. You know, when I noticed some of these things come up. So right now, you know, frankly, I have no idea where customers are coming from. No prediction.
Well, you know, the businesses that are busy and are fully staffed, the degree to which folks like you and I are freed up because some of our other businesses are not focusing on it, it's an opportunity for some of those businesses to invest some time and energy in doing this.
Exactly, so. Exactly. So let's just get into it. So there was a group of 60 different groups in the ad business and the media business that actually wrote a lengthy letter, a request to the AG, I believe somewhere around the first or second week of March. And they asked for a delay through January 2021. You know, they thought, you know, the pandemic was the reason for it. Right?
The part of the problem that many of the businesses that were signatories to this had, and that they were pretty heavily criticized, either directly by the AG, more so indirectly by the AG, and then also sort of directly by privacy advocacy groups, is, you know, it's sort of the same group that has been asking for an extension for months now,
right.
Because and so the criticism being, okay, we understand that this is, you know, unprecedented event, but you've already been telling us that you're not prepared, and so,
right.
or likely won't be prepared, and so we're not inclined to offer you an additional extension just because there's sort of more circumstances on top of it. And I mean, I certainly understand that response. I think that, you know, the AG has probably, in my opinion, not as legal advice, but just as somebody in the, you know, trying to help their own clients in compliance with this. I mean, the fact that there has been slow information coming out of the AG in terms of helping businesses actually figure out how to be compliant, I think that's probably, I mean, that's been as big of an issue as anything that is sort of still an ongoing issue, and that now we have the additional on top of it with COVID-19, but yeah, this was not, the letter was not well received, to say
right.
the least.
But if you really think about it, some of these media and ad companies are indeed in trouble because they are event management companies. You know, media companies, obviously Hollywood is severely impacted, not the digital end of it, but all the movie halls are closed, all the event stuff is closed, theaters are closed, you know, all of that stuff is happening. And, you know, for example, stuff like Coachella and things like that, I mean, they're all shut down. There's like nothing happening. And there is no likelihood of any of the events happening in summer too, from what we are hearing from others. So, but they'll still have the issue, right? So come July 1st, what should these guys do?
I mean, I think that if you are, I think that if we learned anything from the GDPR context, and we certainly can't generalize to say the California Attorney General is going to operate in the same way that the regulators did under GDPR, but there are enough companies for the AG to pay attention to, that if you're making a good effort and actually putting doing something rather than nothing, I think is going to go a lot further when if somebody knocks on your door, whether it be the AG or a consumer or something like that. So there are steps you can take to at least get started down the path to CCPA compliance, even if you are in a position where budgets are cut and staff might be cut, because that's going to go a lot farther than not having anything done. And that's a circumstance where regulators have a tendency to offer corrective action instead of fines, right?
Right.
So I have any number of clients that are not perfect and far from perfect and trying to do something. And the position that you are always trying to get someone into is, at the very least, you've made some substantial effort, that if there is a place where you have fallen down, that either the fine can be minimal because of efforts you've shown, or perhaps it's corrective action to say, you tried this, you fell short, but this is, what you can do to get yourself back into a place in the next 6 months or a year, and then we will revisit and see if a significant fine is appropriate if you haven't done what you need to do. So
exactly. So our recommendation would be, just get started in a very small way, right? You may just have a basic process in place. You may just be doing a simple review of your privacy policy. To begin with, just deploy something for intake management, right? Maybe on your website, maybe just a piece of paper that somebody can download, fill in, and mail it to you if it really comes down to it, right? Mm-hmm. Something to be in place to show intent, right? That's what you basically
you need to have your policy updated to reflect CCPA, and as a part of that, have a method to be responsive to consumers that will experiment, that will either experiment with exercising their rights or have a legitimate, maybe complaint or something where they will try to be exercising their privacy rights against you, and that there's no quicker way to trigger an investigation than to flat out not have the opportunity for that consumer to be making an inquiry with you and exercising those privacy rights. So that's I don't want to say it's an easy first step, but it's somewhat low-hanging fruit in the sense that you can revise your online policy and then have, at the very least, a person monitoring a phone number or an email or mail intake where these rights can be expressed, and you can determine the best way to be doing that. So
exactly. So I want to stop here and see if there are any questions coming in. Anybody has questions? You can actually use the chat window to ask questions.
And keep in mind, for those on the call,
this is Kelly Hemingway, if you don't mind my asking a question. This happens to be a very, very timely event I'm participating in, because I just received a question, and from the San Mateo History Museum, asking whether they need to worry about CCPA compliance. So they would have probably received an invitation to an upcoming event. And the specific question was, is this a county requirement? The museum is asking if the county has a requirement. So that's my question to you. Is this strictly a state, AG level? Or is there any likelihood that counties would get engaged in making sure there's compliance? Do you see any likelihood of that?
So, I mean, the Attorney General is the enforcement agency, right? And so I think that's where you are going to see the enforcement coming from. I think that in the sense that where the complaints up to the Attorney General might come from, I suppose it could come from any number of places. I don't anticipate in the near term counties getting too involved, but that's not to say that the Attorney General won't experiment with and or revise rules or statutes to try to figure out how to increase enforcement, right? By way of example, again, and I don't mean to keep going back to GDPR, but the reason I do is because that was where I did a lot of work in the last few years, and that's really the closest analogy we have, because this hasn't been done in the US before. So in Germany, for example, they have a country level regulator, but I believe they have, it's also regional in that sense. So there's 5 or 6 different enforcement agencies that sit below the main enforcement agency. So,
right. So
yeah,
Kelly,
I don't know if that's going to happen immediately, but it's not to say it couldn't happen at some point. So I'm just curious, Kelly, were they asking if they were responsible for enforcing, or were they concerned that the county might be inquiring with them?
I'll read you. It's just a 2-line question. They just got an email about CCPA compliance, and they're asking, is this something we need to do? And then, does the county require us to comply? So just a little bit of background. The San Mateo County History Museum is not a terribly large museum. They do a lot of, kids go there for school functions, that sort of thing. They don't have a huge amount of foot traffic. They do have like a small retail store in the museum. I'm not sure that they would actually even meet the criteria in terms of collecting and possessing consumer data. But they've been there for a very long time. So I'm not sure if they need to do anything, maybe not. But then the other question is about, will the county require us to comply? I never thought about that.
Yeah, so the number one, I think they may fall into the nonprofit category, number one. Number two, they may not have substantial enough data. If you count that over the past 10 years, they've been collecting data and they have more than 50,000 records of some information or the other, then you might have to worry, but they're in the nonprofit category. So it does not apply to them at this particular point of time. However, and there are 2 more points I want to get Brad's opinion on this that I had noticed. Number one is counties enforcing. Here is my predicate, and of course we have to see how the whole thing pans out. California AG has something called Freedom Fund, or some privacy fund or something like that. I forget the name of it right now, right off the top of my head. It's funded, and counties and DAs and whoever can actually ask for funds from that fund to go after enforcement. That's how that fund works. That's the question. So how likely is it some of these counties and some of these DAs are going to pick up funds from there and try to do privacy enforcement? It's up in the air kind of question, right? That's the number one.
And that's a concept that that's sort of the deputizing of county attorneys and that by the Attorney General, which is a sort of broad concept under most state laws. So yeah, okay. but the TV's right does fit in here in that context. So
well, thank you both. I'm happy I will be able to reply to this inquiry.
Thank you.
Well, and the other quick note of context that I do want to give that might be part of the origin here, and I don't know if it is the degree to which the museum is somehow affiliated with the county, in that they're asking, will similarly affiliated organizations be required by the county to do something? And then the other piece of this being contracting with counties or contracting with state government, the degree to which any entity can, in reality, if they're shoehorning something into a contract, even if an entity might not be regulated by CCPA, or business or entity isn't regulated by CCPA, you always have to be careful and look at your contracts, because you might have CCPA regulated entities that are then putting in their contracts, you as my vendor or you as my affiliate or whatever is also CCPA compliant. And so that is the other piece of that to consider on the county side.
And there is another piece that that I've heard, that the AG is instructing loose instructions to agencies to actually try and see if they comply to CCPA for their information collection and usage. Also, for example, DMV is actually putting some things in place from what I understand. I'll have to verify that again, but they're putting something in place potentially to basically say, yes, we are also compliant. While they don't need to be, they're taking a step towards putting some privacy policy that is similar to CCPA.
So if I could just ask a quick follow-up question,
Yeah.
because I know, for instance, this museum is not particularly large, but there are a number that are probably considered nonprofit, but do a much bigger traffic, if you will, than this small museum. Do you think it's likely that over time, if an organization is large enough that they are compiling a lot of personal data, even if they are a nonprofit, that at some point they might also have to be looking at compliance, even though they're a nonprofit, just by sheer volume of the data, the personal data they're holding?
Yeah, legal angle, I would say not really. But from a consumer angle, I would say, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
It becomes a consumer question at that point.
Yeah.
That's a great point, DV, because that's half of the discussion that I have with clients is, what is your legal obligation, but what is the expectation of your own customers, and how do we is that different, and how do we make sure we're in a good place in both of those with some degree of effort. So
there has been another question whether the slides are going to be available. Yes, the slides and the video recording, we're going to make it available, and we're going to send out a link to that. And that was a question from Megan. Thank you. If you don't have any other questions, I'm going to see if we can close the conversation. And Brad, and thank you everybody for joining. Brad, thank you very much for your insight, and
thanks everybody.
Whatever you're doing with your current customers, and stay safe.
You as well, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.